In this exercise, we are going to provision our 3 virtual machines that are going to be utilizing our network security groups as well as our application security groups. During the provisioning of these virtual machines, we're going to see how we associate our virtual networks and turn off all network security group configurations during the provisioning state of those virtual machines. Once the virtual machines have been successfully deployed, we're going to see how we are going to configure and inject our application security groups to these virtual machines. Remember, we have the third virtual machines that wouldn't be embedding an application security group. So let us go ahead and provision those virtual machine resources. The very first thing I'm going to do is to navigate back to my home page. And then I'm going to go ahead to my More Services. I'm going to select Compute, and then I'm going to select Virtual Machines. Now, these are going to be very simple virtual machines, so we're not going to be provisioning a virtual machine skill set or an availability set, but rather just a simple virtual machine. Each of these virtual machines will, of course, be placed into individual or single zones. So let's go ahead to create those. I'm going to go ahead and first select the resource group, and then I'm going to provide a naming convention for our virtual machine. Because this is the very first virtual machine, it has its own unique number of 01 after leveraging our naming convention that follows the resource group naming. For our region, we're going to leave that as East-US. The availability options is also going to be left as availability zone. As I said just a few seconds ago, this is just going to be a simple virtual machine placed in one zone, so we're going to leave the zone as Zone 1. Next, we're going to look at the image and want to deploy this as a Windows operating system, so we're going to go for the OS image of a Windows server. Next, I'm going to update our size over here to use a more viable virtual machine size. And then I'm going to go ahead to provide the admin login details. Next, we're going to turn off our public inbound ports. And then I'm going to proceed to our networking tab. Now, for our networking configuration, if you remember in our last exercise, we configured an inbound and outbound security rule. If you also remember, our network security group has an attached subnet. This means our virtual network basically has the configuration for our network security group. So by you choosing the right virtual network over here that has its subnet attached to a network security group, our virtual machine inherits the security rules of that network security group. In this case, our virtual network over here actually has a subnet that is attached to our network security group. And so we are on the right track over here. The next we're going to do is to update the public IP naming convention. I'm going to go over here and take this out from here. And I'm going to update this section for here. I'm going to go ahead to click OK. And then we're going to leave our network security group off. This is because we already have a virtual network that has a subnet within it that is attached successfully to a provisioned and deployed network security group. Hence, by virtue, this virtual machine is already inheriting security rules from our network security group via this subnet. And so we're going to leave our network security group off. I'm going to go over here to select this checkbox, and then we're going to go over to our tags. Over here at our tags, I'm going to provide some metadata to give this resource some business meaning. I'm going to select the department of sales, select the environment as production, select the team, as well as the project, and then our cost center. Now I'm going to add one more metadata as a type that has a value of ASG associated, so that whenever users or other developers or engineers take a look at this virtual machine, they will come to the realization that this virtual machine is part of an application security group. So to go ahead and do that, I'm going to put in a new name and value over here as type, and then the value is going to be ASG associated. So now we are ready to validate this virtual machine and then deploy it once the validation has been passed. So it looks like we got an error. I'm going to navigate back over here. So over here, I do not see any error. So this is just Azure having some issues every once in a while. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the review plus create again and see if that validation passes. So we see that validation passes. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this virtual machine. Now, this should take a few minutes, typically 1 to 2 minutes. So I'm going to have it deploy, and once it's successfully deployed, I'm going to be back, and then we're going to deploy our second virtual machine. Now that our virtual machine has been successfully deployed, I'm going to go ahead and click on the create another VM to create our second virtual machine. For our second virtual machine, I'm going to make sure I first select our resource group, and then I'm going to provide this a naming convention. This signifies that this is our second virtual machine within this resource group. I'm going to leave the region as East US as well as the availability options as an availability zone. And then for the availability zone, I'm going to leave it as zone 1. We're also okay with our operating system image as a Windows server. And so I'm going to also leave our size this way and provide our user admin credentials. Again, because our virtual network has an attached subnet to it that has been associated with our network security group, we do not need any network security group configured while provisioning our virtual machine. So I'm going to take this off, and then we're going to go to our networking tab. In our networking tab as well, we're going to leave this network security group off as well too. We already have our virtual network that already has its attached subnet to our network security group, so we are good over here. And I'm just going to update the naming convention for our public IP. I'm going to take this out. I'm going to come over here and update this properly. And then I'm going to click OK. And then we have everything all good for our networking. I'm going to go ahead and select that delete so that once we delete our virtual machine eventually, it can delete all other resources such as our network interface. I'm going to go over to our tags, and over here I'm going to supply metadata details. I'm going to add our team. This is the team that is going to be in charge of this cloud resource, and I'm going to associate this with a project. I'm going to apply a cost center, and then lastly, I'm going to indicate that the second virtual machine has a type of ASG associated. And so over here right now, we are ready to perform a review plus create where we get our validation. And once that is done, we're going to go ahead and deploy this virtual machine. That looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and deploy this. This, of course, will also take a few minutes. So I'm going to be back once the deployment of this is successful, and then we'll go ahead to provision our third virtual machine. Now that our second virtual machine is successfully deployed, I'm going to go ahead and provision our third virtual machine. So over here, I'm going to select our right resource group, and then I'm going to provide the virtual machine name for this. Over here, we're indicating that this is a third virtual machine within our resource group. And so I'm going to leave our region as the East US. I'm going to leave the availability option this way. I'm going to also ensure that this is only deployed into one zone. Over here, we're okay with our operating system image for the Windows server, and then we're also okay with the size. I'm going to go ahead and provide the user admin credentials for this virtual machine. And I'm going to turn off our inbound port over here, and then we're going to go to our networking tab. Over here, we see that our virtual network is also selected, and if you remember, this is the same virtual network we're using across the 3 virtual machines. And this virtual network has an attached subnet that is also associated with our network security group, thereby inheriting the security rules as well as the application security group that is configured inside our network security group. For this, we do not need any network security group configured. I'm going to go ahead to update the naming convention for this public IP as well. I'm going to go over here and take this out. I'm going to come back over here and replace this with the word IP. and this looks okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select that. Now we have our virtual network, subnet, and public IP in place with our network security group totally turned off. I'm going to go ahead and check this box, and then we're going to go ahead to our tags. Over here, I'm going to supply the same types of metadata for our tags, except this third virtual machine is not going to be placed into an application security group. And so when it comes to the type, I'm not going to add that type as one of the metadata. So let's go ahead and provision the details over here. I'm going to go ahead and select sales over here. I'm going to go ahead and select our environment as production, add our team that is going to be owning this resource, and then attach or associate this with a project. Finally, I'm going to pass in a cost center for billing purposes, and we're going to be done over here. The reason why we're not going to be adding this type as ASG associated is because this third virtual machine is not going to be associated with our application security group. However, if you want to still add a type and say non-ASG associated, you are welcome to do that as well. For now, we are going to deploy this once we have a validation from our review and create. So let's go ahead and do that. Over here, we have a validation passed, and so now we are ready to deploy our third virtual machine. This is also going to take a few minutes, so I'm going to be back once the third virtual machine has been deployed successfully, and then we're going to go ahead to confirm that our virtual machines have the network security group that we provisioned earlier associated with them. And then for the virtual machine 1 and virtual machine 2, we are going to associate them with our application security group. Now that our third virtual machine has been successfully deployed, we can now go ahead to access all 3 virtual machines and proceed with our further configurations. The very first thing I want to do is to access our resource group so that I can take a look at all of the resources we've created so far. For that, I'm going to click on the resource group over here. And over here within our resource group, we can see that we have about 15 resources that have been deployed. We can also filter them by grouping them into types. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And over here, we can see all of the details. Within this resource group, we have 1 application security group. We have 3 disks for the 3 different virtual machines. Of course, 3 interfaces for our 3 virtual machines as well. We have our network security group that has been provisioned here already, as well as 3 different public IP addresses for our 3 virtual machines. Over here, we're also provided with our 3 virtual machines, and we can see our virtual network that has been associated with our 3 virtual machines during the provisioning state of these virtual machines. So let's go into virtual machine 1 and take a look to see what is going on. Over here, within our overview page, the very first thing I'm going to do is to go to our network settings. If you remember, during the provisioning of each of these virtual machines, we did not configure a network security group. However, we relied on the virtual network that has an attached subnet to it that is associated with our network security group. This means if I go into our network settings, I should see that our network settings has the configurations for network security rules based on the virtual network that has been associated to this virtual machine. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Over here, when I scroll down, I can see my inbound security rules. And so we can see that even though we did not provision a network security group during the creation of our virtual machines, we still have it in here, courtesy of our virtual network. I can also go ahead and confirm our outbound rules as well. We can see all of the outbound rules that we configured as well. Now, because this is our very first virtual machine, we have the network security group in place. However, we also have our application security group over here. Now, this virtual machine needs to be associated with our application security group so that once we start utilizing these security rules against our virtual machine, we can have our virtual machine operate the way it is expected to work based on our security rules configured to our application security group. To achieve that, we are going to go over to our left menu here and select our application security group. And over here, we are going to associate this virtual machine with our application security group. To go ahead and do that, I'm going to click the Add Application Security Groups over here. And from here, I'm going to select our application security group. And then I'm going to go ahead to click add. And this associates our virtual machine with our application security group. What this means is that when we go back to our networking, because as we can see right now, under the application security groups, this virtual machine is now associated with an application security group. When we go back to the network settings, what this means is that this virtual machine not only recognizes this network security rules, but also recognizes that this application security group is now a part of the virtual machine. And so with that in place, we are going to go back to our virtual machine 2 to perform the same action. To do that easily, I'm going to go back to our overview page and select our resource group. I'm going to quickly group this by type so that I can easily locate our virtual machines. I'm going to select our second virtual machine. I'm going to confirm that we have security rules in place. And since I can confirm that with the inbound port rules and the outbound port rules, I'm going to go ahead to our application security group to go and associate this second virtual machine with our application security group. I'm going to go ahead and click add. And then I'm going to associate it and click the add button as well. And that has been successfully updated. And so now we can see that the second virtual machine as well has a connection to our application security group. Now we still have one more virtual machine, which is the third virtual machine. And if you remember, we said our third virtual machine is not going to be associated with our application security group. Now let's go and observe our third virtual machine as well as our network security group. To do that, I'm going to also head back to our overview, select our resource group, and then filter this by type. And then I'm going to select the third virtual machine down here. Over here, as we can see, we are not going to associate the application security group to this third virtual machine. The reason is because based on the principles of the security rules that we've provisioned and configured for our network security group, we've decided that only 2 virtual machines will be placed into our application security group. The third virtual machine will sit outside the application security group, but still utilize the security rules of our network security group. And so if I go to the network settings, what is going to happen to the third virtual machine is that when it starts implementing the security rules, those security rules for the inbound network security would not be associated with these first 2 security rules. It will only apply to this third security rule because it does not recognize these 2 application security groups. The same goes for the outbound port rules for this virtual machine. It will not recognize this particular outbound security rule because it has a destination of an application security group, and we do not configure application security group for our third virtual machine. And so with that in place, let us go and take a quick look again at our network security group. For us to do that, I can easily go back to our resource group, but let us go to our home page and let us select network security group from over here. Over here, I'm going to select our provision network security group. I'm going to give us some more space over here. And we can see at the overview page level all our inbound and outbound security rules. And so for our third virtual machine, again, it is not going to be applicable to any destination that has the application security group because it is not configured or associated at the virtual machine level to the application security group. In our next lesson, we're going to take a look at how we're going to test our virtual machines. The first virtual machine and the second virtual machine are going to be tested against each other, and we're going to see that we can actually remote or jump into our virtual machine 2 from our virtual machine 1, courtesy of the application security group that they are both under. We are also going to configure and log in remotely into our virtual machine 3. In this case, we are going to provision and deploy a Azure Bastion to log in into our virtual machine 3. So see you at the next lesson.